It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Zarqa Nawaz. I am going to be very brief, but this woman has accomplished a lot. She and her family live in Saskatchewan, and she started out making films after she didn't get into med school. But she went on to write, and she was the creator of the CBC TV hit sitcom Little Mosque on the Prairie that ran for 7 years? 6 years. And it has been syndicated worldwide. And I'm just going to turn it over to Zarqa.
Can you hear me? Oh, this is so great. I don't even have to carry the microphone like Dorothy did. And you're going to catch me if I pitch off the stage, yes? I'm going to be careful, you guys. It's my honor to be standing here today. When Dorothy was saying how she had read my book, and this is what had inspired the event in her mind, and to me that just blew me away, because when I wrote the book, I remember crying, thinking, no one's going to read this, and no one's going to enjoy this, and my editor's like, you're right, you rewrite it. And they made me do it. I rewrote that book 2 times because I thought that I could make people understand Islam and Muslims if I wrote a really serious book about Islam. And my editor was like, yeah, this is unreadable, right? This is so bad. And you're a sitcom writer and you write comedy. Why are you trying to be serious? And I was like, because people don't take comedians seriously. They take op-ed writers in the New York Times seriously. They think we're silly people. And she's like, well, you're just going to have to channel that silliness and be who you are, because being serious is not getting you anywhere. And it was a really strange thing, because so many people have told me, especially serious writers, that they want to write comedy, and then the comedy writers want to write the serious stuff, right? And the grass is always greener on the other side, because deep in my heart, I feel like whenever I write comedies, people don't actually connect with it. I don't really think about the big pictures of poverty and violence and systemic racism, and I have to write about those issues in a serious way. So it was incredible when Dorothy was telling me that, this book was an inspiration to her, because I was like, oh my God, comedy does have a place in this world, and it helps people connect with other people and issues. And so I guess it's not a curse, right? To be able to write in a funny way. And what I love about coming here to Silver Spire is to see all the support that newcomers are getting, because it actually occurred to me sitting there listening to Dorothy that I used to be a newcomer too, right? In 1972. And a lot of the infrastructures that exist today didn't exist in the early 70s. And we were just sort of thrown into Canada and sort of expected to thrive. And it was such a challenge for us. And now I think, thank God that there are so many more resources for people, because it can be a really scary and difficult world to navigate when you've just come, especially for people who are coming from much more difficult circumstances. But I wanted to talk about my circumstances and what led me here today. And I would have to go back to 1947. And that's not when I was born. That was when, I look really good for my age, right? Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but that was the time period known as the greatest human migration, when England had colonized India and then decided to split the country into Hindu and Muslim states. Before, my father, who grew up in India, had told me that Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus lived in relative peace for centuries, right? And then when the British colonizers came in, they have this sort of divide and conquer mentality, where they get people who have lived together. They figure out what are the weak points, how can we divide them, and usually they pick like race or skin color or faith. And so they created a situation where Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs could no longer live together in safety, that they would become enemies of one another. And this was sort of the way the colonizers would work when they would go into countries to weaken the system so they could be the ones in power and pick the leaders. So my father said once, it was decided that India would be split into, Pakistan, Muslim, and India, Hindu, overnight, people became enemies. People that they'd lived with forever, started killing one another. And it was no longer safe to be if you were in the wrong section. So my father's family was in India, and they were Muslims, and they had to leave. like they had to just take what they could, which was very little, just mostly children and babies, and just leave. So all the money, all the land, all the businesses, whatever life they had to abandon, and they had to live in refugee camps, get loaded into trains. And I'm sure you've probably seen movies, those trains that went across the country and got them to Muslim, or Hindu areas. And some of those trains would be stopped. If, people would try to stop those trains and then slaughter whoever was on those trains. You weren't even sure if you could make it. And so my father was 15 during that mass migration. And they moved from Ludhiana, India to Faisalabad, Pakistan. And he, in our culture, my father said he was the eldest son. And in that culture, the eldest son becomes responsible for the whole family. He sort of becomes a pseudo-father. And he realized at that really young age that the only thing that no one can take away from you, because everything was taken away from them, was education. And he realized the only way they were going to survive, because they had factories and businesses in India, and they lost all that, and they were plunging into indentured poverty very quickly. And so he got scholarships. He did really well in high school, and he got into university with scholarships, and he became an engineer. And he needed to now support his younger brothers and sisters and get them educated and married and set up, because he was the one who was the first one that had gotten a formal education. And so at that time, England, the country that had caused the problems for him in the first place, was looking for engineers. And wouldn't you know it, how many of you have heard of the Mersey tunnels in Liverpool? Have you heard of the Mersey tunnels? I don't even know what that is, but it's a tunnel under the, okay, so it's sort of a big concrete tunnel under Mersey. Is there a river? Mersey? Oh, there's a river. Oh, I didn't even know that. There's a river. So they needed, and they made of concrete, right? So my father was a concrete specialist, so they were hiring civil engineers with knowledge in concrete. And so he left Pakistan to work in Liverpool on the Mersey tunnel. And so, he sent every cent back home to Pakistan so he could get his younger brothers and sisters educated and married and established in their lives. And now he was like in his 30s, right? And so the village back home was like, so is this his whole life that he's just going to work and send every penny back home? And his parents were like, look, listen, he's not willing to leave. Like he feels this is his destiny, and my father is a very proud man who believes in taking care of one's family, and he won't listen to us. So one day, while he was working, we got a telegram. Those who are very young, this is before iPhones. This predates even. You couldn't even get telephone calls from overseas. You'd get like a telegram, that would come, and in it said, "Come home quickly. Your father is very ill." And so he had to rush back home to Pakistan, and they're only to be greeted by a band and a wedding ceremony and a shiny new wife. And that was how they did it back then, right? This is what you call not just arranged marriage, but old school arranged marriage, where you didn't even know you were getting married, right? And I know it boggles the mind, and I ask my mom and dad all the time, like, how? How is that? How do you do that? And she's like, it's just the time period. It's just the way you're raised. It's just like that's the way it was, Nobody got left behind. Didn't matter what you looked like. If you were going to get married, you're going to get married. You couldn't complain later, right? That was the way it was. I mean, it solves a lot of problems, right? It solves the problems of singlehood. Nobody's single ever in those type of cultures. So, and I guess family reunification must have been instantaneous, because he was able to bring his, shiny new bride back to Mersey in Liverpool. And guess who was born a year later, right? In Mersey Hospital, right? So that's how I came to be born in Liverpool, England, because that used to be the route of immigrants back in the day. They went from Pakistan, India to the UK first, because they were looking for educated immigrants. And then after a while, they got kind of tired of them and said, there's too many, we need to shut the doors and make it more difficult. But then the next country that was like, wait, we could use educated immigrants was Canada. So Canada actually set up shop in the UK and was poaching England's immigrants that were educated, going, you know what, we're building the CN Tower, which is also made of concrete. Concrete is the reason, you guys, of my existence. And we could use a concrete specialist. So then he moved. My father realized Canada was offering him a better deal than England was. They're like, if you come, we'll give you a job, we'll give you citizenship, we'll give your children citizenship, we'll let you live in a really good area, and you can sponsor your family, and you can bring your family. So these were the perks of citizenship. And so my father moved his family to Toronto, Canada, where he worked on the CN Tower as well as other projects, and I grew up in Toronto. And they had 3 kids. I'm the only daughter, and so I have 2 younger brothers. And so my father, as you can imagine, had grown up in really, really difficult and traumatic circumstances when his family had to flee. And so he became really obsessed with education, like obsessed with education. And as all of you probably know, what is the #1 career choice of immigrant fathers? Medicine. Medicine. It's like no other career exists for them on this planet other than medicine. And they are obsessed with it. Because my father believed, once you got educated and you became a doctor, you'd make lots and lots of money, and then you would never, ever, as a woman, need to get married. Because for him, marriage for women, was for those people who didn't get into medical school, right? And because then you need a man to help support you, and and then you'd have to have babies, blah blah blah. And he was like, I know, it's really strange. He was a very conservative Muslim man, but because he had seen when he left for England, and when he came back, he would see his sisters who had left very young. They had been married off, and they hadn't been able to get an education because in that culture they felt that they would be safer as married women, with husbands and families to look after them, rather than single women. And he believed in his heart that if his sisters had had a chance to get educated, they could have become financially independent and would have had very different lives. And so he started to really get down upon the whole issue of marriage and babies. Every time a woman would come and visit us, he would ask her, so what level of education do you have? And if she had a BSc, he would say, well, why didn't you get a master's? And she goes, oh, because I got married, right? And had children. And he said, see, that's the reason, right? And if she had a master's, well, why didn't you get a PhD? And it would always be because she got married and had children, right? And if she had a PhD, why aren't you head of the IMF at the United Nations? And it would always be, like, he would always locate the one part of that woman's life where everything went downhill, and there was always a man involved, right? Always. And thus he sort of absorbed this notion that men and marriage were bad for women, right? They would be what held women back. And thus, if you went to medical school and made a lot of money, there'd be no reason to get married, because men hold your life back. And that was a mantra that I grew up with. Go to medical school, make a lot of money, never get married, right? Of course, my mother did not appreciate this mantra because she did not consider her life as a failure, having married my dad. But he was manic. He was manic to the point of obsession. And so I became manic to the point of obsession and tried to get into medical school. And I did really, really well in high school. But once I got to university, that was when all these courses that they make you take to try to get into medical school, like physics and organic chemistry, and like calculus and these things, I just couldn't summon enough energy and passion for these courses. I just didn't have the talent for it. And after 4 years of science, I didn't have the marks to get into medical school. So when I applied anyway, and I got the rejection letter. So you can just imagine, right, getting this, because you have been bred since you were like an embryo for only one goal in life, and that's medical school. That is it, right? And so I remember sitting there going, oh my God, right? Like, what happens when you don't get into medical school? Like, there's no plan B. There was no plan B ever, right? And so I sat there, like, literally thinking, that's it. My life is over. There's nothing left. I didn't get in. But my mom, who was waiting in the wings for a very long time, goes, I have a plan B. We'll get you married, right? So the next thing I know, like Pakistani mothers, they have this network of friends across North America, right? They just and they all know where all the single guys are. And of course, because Pakistan sends a lot of PhD candidates, I guess, to study their doctorates in the US, and they, get their PhDs, and then they have to go back to Pakistan for 2 years to fulfill the requirements because the government paid for them to go to go to North America. So these guys kind of want to stay in the country, and so they're looking for citizenship with benefits, right? So there's an endless supply of them, endless. And they gradually, my mom would, find where they were, and one by one they would start to show up in the living room, right? And I would be like, oh my God, I'm going to wind up as a housewife in Karachi if I don't figure out my life soon, right? So it was like, good grief, I'm not ready to I'm not ready from not getting into medical school to suddenly becoming a housewife. It was just like those were the two avenues. The one that was hated and told that you never ever do this or you'll destroy your life. And so I was like, no, I can't do that, right? Not yet, anyway, right? And so I was so desperate. I was like, oh my God, like there was so much pressure from my mom and her friends that I had to, lick my wounds and say, pull it together. What could you possibly do with your life? And a friend of mine, she was always talking about going to Ryerson and becoming a filmmaker and writing like being an artist and, novels and plays and films and newspapers, like those are really sexy, forbidden careers, right? Those were never the careers that were ever floated in front of you as possibilities, for good Muslim women. I mean, that was sort of, somewhere the exotic things, right? Like wearing fishneck stockings or lip gloss. I mean, good Muslim women don't do those things, right? But it was just in my mind because I think I was enjoying the 1 or 2 arts classes that I was allowed to take in university. I think I only took 1 or 2, right? That because in the requirements there's not a lot of space for art courses, but I had done well in those courses. And the application form for Ryerson's journalism program was still accepting submissions. So I applied. I applied to Ryerson, and I didn't have a portfolio because naturally, had never expected to apply, but they granted me an interview. In that time period, they would grant people interviews. So I went in, and I was waiting, I was in the waiting room reading women's magazines, and an elderly man invited me in. He was a professor of journalism, and he said, you know why we granted you an interview? And I was like, no. He goes, you are the only applicant with a BSc. Every other applicant here has a BA. Why would you apply, to the journalism school of the BSc? And I said, well, Ryerson is the most, prestigious and competitive journalism school in all of Canada, right? And I knew that if I was going to stand out from all the other BAs, I would have to do something unique and different. So I got a BSc because my whole life, all I've ever really wanted to be is a journalist, right? And he was like, my God, that is such forward thinking. Who knew that someone would plan so well, right? And I said, I know. And he says, well, what could you do with your science degree, like in the journalism program? And I was thinking to myself, oh my God, right? Because they don't teach you anything in the science program that's of any value, practical value. So I'm like, but I had read those women's magazines, and at that time period, I had just read an article about Norplant. I don't know if you guys remember, but it was women used to take birth control. I mean, he's nodding. I'm like, why do you know so much about birth control, right? In those days, you would take birth control pills every day, but this was a device they put in your arm, and it would release hormones for 5 years, and you'd never have to think about it again, right? And I said, listen, this is what they taught us in physics class, this device that they put in your arm. And this, articles about this device should be in all women's magazines. And he goes, you're right. You're absolutely right. We should know about these things. And who better to tell us than you, right? Because of this, thank God, his wife is probably in menopause, because, it was like written about in every single women's magazine sitting out there. And based on that, he let me in to the best journalism school, arguably the best journalism school in the country. And that's when I started to thrive as a storyteller. And I realized that this was actually the place that I belonged, that I could tell story. And I was good at it. And you know who my instructor was at Ryerson? Stuart McLean. Yes. He was the radio broadcast teacher. I'm so glad I'm talking to an audience that actually knows what I'm talking about. Whenever I talk to high school students, I'll have to say, he was like the Jian Ghomeshi of his time without the weird sexual stuff, right? So he was amazing. Stuart McLean taught me, how to tell a story in his class. And then I won Best Radio Documentary in his class. And then we went on to the Ontario Telefest Awards. Those still go on. I don't know. In my day, they were all the journalism schools competed against each other for different projects, and I was competing in the radio documentary against other universities with journalism programs, and I won overall. So a student and I were standing together, and they were about to take our picture, and I can feel this tapping on my shoulder, and it was my mother, and I go, Mom, you can't be in this picture. It's me and Stuart, and she's like. And she's like, yeah, neither can you, because if a picture with you and a white man gets out, people will think you've had an affair with him, and I'll never be able to get you married, right? This is true, you guys. She made me move over, and they put someone else in my place. I had to wait 20 years later till Stuart came. When he was doing the Vinyl Cafe tours? He came to Saskatchewan, and I, got my picture taken with him, and I sent it to my mother on her iPad. And she's like, I don't care anymore. You're married, and you're your husband's problem, right? So revenge is never a dish served cold or hot with a Pakistani mom. So I did really well in his course, and the person who won that award got to be an intern on Peter Zosky's show, Morningside. You guys remember? And so it was so wonderful. So I was working with Peter Zosky, and when you work with Peter Zosky on that show, for those who don't know, he was the best of the best when it came to interviewing people across the country. His show was, it was the highest rated show on CBC, even more higher rated than, Peter Mansbridge or the what do they call them, TV shows, right? It was on radio. That's unusual for radio to be that highly regarded and highly rated. But by watching him, I realized that he was sort of, I would do all the interviews and write questions, and there were several of us, and we'd hand him those questions, and he would make this magic on air. And I just felt in my core that I was missing something, that there was this creative energy inside of me that couldn't be tapped sort of by doing this journalism thing for him. And then I realized probably in retrospect, I should have gone to film school, but I was like, oh my God, I've done 2 degrees now. I don't want to do like a 3rd one. And so a friend of mine said, listen, you don't actually have to go to film school to become a filmmaker. It's like plumbing, right? It's like a vocation. You can learn on the job. What you really need to find out is if you could write story. So why don't you take a short 3-week summer workshop at the Ontario College of Art. They might still offer it, I'm not sure. Where you take a summer, so it's only 3 weeks. They put you in groups of 5. One of you guys is the writer-director, and the other ones become your camera crew, like sound and lights and holding the boom. And so I had to write, so I took that course, and I had to write a 5-minute film. So I was thinking, what could be my topic for that 5-minute film? And it was, let me guess, it was 1990, I had my kid at 94, so 95 is how I have to remember things, when the children were born. So she was 1, so it was 1995, and I was thinking about the topic for a 5-minute film, and the Oklahoma bombing happened. And in the Toronto Star, they had all these pictures of Muslim suspects, right? And 2 days later, they arrested Timothy McVeigh. And he was a white supremacist, militia leader, a veteran who was trying to bring down the American government because he was very angry at them for mishandling the Waco siege earlier, and he was trying to decide how to bring down the American government. He was thinking about assassinating politicians, but then he thought, why not kill a whole bunch of innocent people in federal buildings to start a war? So he took a truck full of explosives and rammed it into a building and killed 167 people. And at that time period, it was the largest domestic terrorism event in the United States. And it was so interesting, right? Because we're seeing parallels now where the media was so obsessed with the brown Muslim enemy, that they wouldn't even consider that the enemy could be white and within their own society and against their own government and trying to create a war and dissension. And I thought, wow, this would make an interesting film. So I wrote a film called Barbecue Muslims, where there were 2 Muslim brothers who were sleeping one night, and the barbecue blows up. And they're accused of being Middle Eastern terrorists, terrorizing their suburban Oakville neighborhood. And they're like, yeah, we've never even been to the Middle East. We don't know who blew up our barbecue. It just blew up. And so they get put in jail, and the real perpetrators of that terrorism incident are this group that's against global warming. They're ahead of their time in the 1990s. And they're called the Barbecue Anti-Resistant Front. And they're very upset that people are barbecuing in their backyards because it's giving off carbon dioxide and resulting in global warming. And so they figured the only way to get attention to their cause is by blowing up the barbecues. But they accidentally blew up a Muslim's barbecue. And now they're picketing in front of the police station going, no, give all the attention off of the Muslims back onto us because we are the real perpetrators. And nobody cares about them, and they're arguing, and they're like, why would you blow up a Muslim barbecue? And his friend listen, they're barbecues, they're unmarked, they're ecumenically neutral. Nobody actually puts Jewish barbecue or Buddhist barbecue or Hindu barbecue. There's no crosses, stuck into the barbecues. They're just barbecues. We actually don't know what faith, the owners are. We just blow them up, right? And he goes, well, now we've made a horrible mistake because we've blown up a Muslim barbecue, and now everything's, we're never going to get the attention. So I submitted that to the Toronto International Film Festival, and then a few months later, I get a very irate phone call from the programmer from the Toronto International Film Festival, and he's like, there are people who are going to be so upset with me for programming your film. And I go, why? He goes, because they make technically perfect films, and then there's your film, right? Because I had used my brother and his friend, and we had shot in my parents' bedroom, and I had recruited all the neighbors to be all the actors. And it was really bad and schlocky, right? But he's like, nobody else is doing satires about terrorism and Islam, because we've never seen anything like this before, so we are forced to program it. I was like, okay. Right? He goes, but next time, we're not giving you another chance like this again, so pull it together. Right? So my film got into the Toronto International Film Festival, which is one of the most prestigious film festivals in the world. Thank you. And what it did was it opened up that door for me, because once you get in, then you can start applying for funding to other grant-giving agencies across Canada, because they're like, okay, now she's made it, so she's obviously a serious filmmaker. So then I cobbled together $30,000, that's what it took. Because back in those days, this was actual real film, not video, which is less expensive, but film was very expensive to, to shoot and then process. And I had to come up with another idea. And that was when the media was really obsessed with fatwas of death. Do you remember Salman Rushdie and Taslima Nasreen? It's so good to, I have to explain this to people who are younger, right? Like, it's like 10 years ago, there was this man called Salman Rushdie, right? And he got into a fight with Iran, in Iran. And so anyway, it's a long story, but so I wrote a novel called Death Threat, and it was about a young woman who can't get her novel published, so she tries to get a death threat on purpose. So she figures if everyone believes her community is always giving death threats out willy-nilly, then she should take advantage of her, racial stereotypes. Why can't she get one? So she goes out to the mosque. No one's paying attention. She can't get a publisher for her book. It's really bad, but she figures she should still get a publisher because she feels that she deserves it. But she's going to take a shortcut to fame. So she goes to the mosque and starts to vandalize it and break things, and hopefully hoping that the Muslims will sentence her to death. And they're just repairing the mosque and trying to get her to a psychiatrist. And she's like, they're not cooperating, right? So she's like, I can't depend on my Muslim community. I'm going to have to go somewhere else. And she reads the local newspaper, and there is only men invited meeting of the Hamas at the local university. So she figures this is perfect. She types up her own death threat, figures she's worth about $3 million, and she signs it. And she wears the niqab, which are really useful for these sort of adventures, goes to the university and goes to the all-men's class, and there's a sign, and she realizes she's misread it. Instead of an all-male class for Hamas, it's an all-male cooking class for hummus, right? But she decides to try to save the day. And when the chickpea delivery guy comes, she signs for it and sends him away. And so when the instructor opens the door, she hands him the death threat because he thinks he's signing for the chickpeas. And presto, he gets his chickpeas, right? She gets her death threat, he gets his chickpeas. And so I submitted that film to the Toronto International Film Festival. If you're curious, these films are on my website, zarqanawaz.com. I got them digitized because whenever I give speeches like this, people are like, how do we watch these? And they're all there for you to watch. And that also got accepted to the Toronto International Film Festival, and they were much happier this time because I had actually hired proper crew and proper actors, the whole bit. And so I was doing well with that film when the National Film Board of Canada approached me and said, listen, we can tell that you're good at making kooky films, but we want you to pick a subject that's more serious, that matters to you. What would you like to talk about in your community? And it was so interesting because I had moved from Ontario to Saskatchewan at that time period, and we prayed in a mosque, which was, I believe, also a church. I think it was a Presbyterian church. I have to go look at the brick. It's written in the brick, engraved in the wall, but I've got to read it. In the 1950s, so a lot of Muslims prayed in converted churches that had, sold them to Muslim communities. And so we were in I'm pretty sure it would be like this, a hall like this. And we pray without pews. You've seen Muslims pray, so we pray on ground. And one day we got an imam from Saudi Arabia, and he was like, wow, there's men and women in the same prayer hall, in our culture. It's cultural for him, but he gets culture and religion mixed up, and he goes, I don't want to see the women like this. I want a curtain, and the women to pray behind the curtain. And one day I came to the mosque, and there's like literally a shower curtain, right? And the women were praying behind it. And I was like, well, wait, what's going on? And what I was realizing was that, in Islam, women are not required to pray up in balconies or behind curtains. It's sort of like a cultural belief system that's, come up in countries like Saudi Arabia, where it's more misogynistic and patriarchal. And because people mix up theology and tradition, people thought this was what Islam required. So I thought, I'm going to do a documentary which breaks this down and says, no, go back to the sources and say this is not what's required in Islam. Men and women during the time of the Prophet Muhammad used to pray in the same prayer hall without barriers, and that if the imam or the prayer leader said something inappropriate regarding women during the sermon, women used to actually stand up and say, that's wrong, you're wrong, correct what you're saying right now, right? They used to do that. And today you couldn't see those women because they'd be behind a shower curtain, right? And so I did this documentary where I traveled across the country and interviewed, men and women scholars and men and women in mosques. And they all agreed with me. They go, you're right. This is something that we have to deal with. It's developed over the centuries, and it's wrong, and it's debilitating for mosques. And so that documentary was called Me and the Mosque. And so the National Film Board sent me to the Banff Television Festival where we were going to, discuss our documentaries. And a friend of mine said, normally people go there to discuss, to pitch television shows. That's actually the real purpose of the Banff Television Festival. I thought, wow, okay. I don't know anything about television, but since they're paying my way for like 2 or 3 days, I might as well make the best of it. And so a friend of mine gave me a template of how to make a TV show, the log line and the characters. And in my mind, I thought it would be so interesting to have a mosque where the imam, believes very strongly in gender equity. And what would that look like? How would that change the atmosphere in the mosque? How would it change how women feel, how men feel, how conservative worshippers feel? And so I came up with this idea of a television show about a mosque in a church, because I had gone to a mosque in a church my whole life, and how both congregations would deal with each other. And I pitched it, and it was so interesting, right? Because the CBC at that time, this was 2005, they said, Islam and Muslims are in the zeitgeist right now. This was right on the heels of the Danish cartoon controversy with the Prophet Muhammad's cartoons and all the violence that was happening in Europe. And they're like, we've been looking for a project that can kind of take that and deal with that in the manner that you're suggesting. And then comedy, is something that we would really like. And so we went into development, and we started shooting. And it was so interesting because normally in Canada, this is back in 2007, you guys have to remember, we hadn't had any sitcoms that were successful in Canada since King of Kensington and the Beachcombers. Do you guys remember those shows? We hadn't had anything since those, right? And in Canada, there was a sense that we just couldn't make sitcoms. It was just something the Americans could do. Something about us, it wasn't possible. I remember reading that, like Canada just can't do sitcoms. It's an American invention. We are incapable of it. And so what happens is a lot of times when Canadian television shows come out, we are so busy watching the American television shows because they're so big and they have millions and millions of ad dollars, and we're overwhelmed by their programming, that we're not even aware that our programming actually exists, right? So when the US found out that, oh my God, not only is CBC doing a show about Muslims, it's doing a show about religion, and they're making it into a comedy, and they're crazy because the Muslims will kill them and like blow up the buildings and flip the cars and burn down Canada. So they would send all these reporters, got sent out to us. And we never, as Canadians, get this much media attention. And the New York Times and CNN, Al Jazeera, we were just being covered night and day. Enough so that the Canadian media was like, wait, what's happening? Is there a show being shot here? And so then they started paying attention. And so what we got was all this unpaid advertising that we normally could never afford. And it was enough to get Canadians to be aware that there was a TV show on CBC. And then it aired to record ratings. We had ratings on CBC that we hadn't had since Anne of Green Gables 20 years earlier because people watched it, right? And those were enough to keep us going, because normally shows fail on our networks because they just don't have the ratings to keep going. But we had the ratings now, and people were interested, and they started watching it. But what was really interesting to me was the people who were paying attention to us were the Europeans, right? Because this managed to get across, the oceans, various oceans. I'm not good at geography, various oceans out there to Europe. And they were like watching this, and then suddenly I got calls and visits from reporters in Europe, and they were like, we don't understand how this is possible. I'm like, I go, understand what? And they're like, there's Muslims and Christians living together normally. And I go, yeah. They're like, so that doesn't happen in our country. And that was when I realized that what Canada and the United States have when it comes to assimilating and integrating newcomers, Europe is like abysmal at. They don't have multicultural policies the way we do. They don't have infrastructures to welcome newcomers, people like you guys who, have, setting up systems where people come and they are supported. What they have instead are systems, systems of systemic racism that treat newcomers very much how Mexicans and blacks are treated in the United States, right? Where it's very difficult to get a foothold, and First Nations to get a foothold and to move forward because people don't want them to, or there are systems set up that make it impossible. And one example would be, say, Germany. When Germany wanted to rebuild after World War II, they brought in Turkish immigrants, right? But as temporary workers, never wanting them to become German citizens, not allowing them to live in the city. They were sorry, my nose always runs when I talk, so I have this as my crutch. So the Turkish citizens had to live on the outskirts of town in what were essentially ghettos, right? And the Germans were hoping to send them back after a few years, after they helped rebuild their country. But when it happened, the jobs and the infrastructure projects took a long time, so generations lived there, and they would go home and get married and have children, and they would not have citizenship, neither would their children. Thus, their children couldn't go to university. Thus, they couldn't get good jobs. Thus, there was no way forward, so they were sort of stuck in purgatory, right? And so then you had millions of citizens who are essentially born and raised in Germany, who are no longer Turkish, who are really German, because that's the only country they've known, but they don't have access to upward mobility, because without citizenship, you can't do much, right? There's a lot of jobs you don't have access to. You don't have access to higher levels of education or affordable education. And so suddenly they had a huge problem of migrants, right, who had lived there legitimately for generations, who could claim to be German, but weren't really able to be German. And so you had this issue happening in European countries. Lots of laws that were starting to be passed, not wearing hijab. Like if I had been born in Europe, I wouldn't have been able to, in certain countries like France, been able to go to school or have an education, because they would have removed me, because any girl who decides to wear hijab is removed from school. And so, to me, like when people talk about the Taliban removing girls from school, the same thing is actually happening in Europe, right? They'll remove you, and they'll take you out. And not only that, if you don't wear hijab, but if you wear like a long skirt, a maxi skirt, that's considered too modest, and modesty has somehow only become a value associated with Islam for some reason, and they'll take you out of school or make it much more difficult to learn. And so you have these underground communities developing, because you don't want a girl to go underground and have like private religious schools, because those are not schools that are up to the standard of public. So then you end up creating a population that has very poor academic skills, is having trouble with upward mobility and fitting in and assimilating into society, because you've set up now these systems of systemic racism that's creating a permanent underclass, right? And so so if you look at Canada and the United States, economically, the Muslim immigrant is doing well in terms of rates of education, in terms of rates of employment. We don't have ghettos. We tend to live in, mixed communities overall, whereas in Europe, Muslims have the highest rates of crime, highest rates of unemployment. They tend to live on the outskirts of town. So you can see the difference in assimilation and integration, and how having effective multicultural policies can change a way a population can thrive in your country. And so they were watching Little Mosque on the Prairie for an entirely different reason than I had made it. I had made it because I was mad at the imam from Saudi Arabia for being such a sexist jerk, and they were watching it because they were watching a country that had figured out multiculturalism, right? I know we have our issues, but not the issues that they have. And they couldn't figure out what it was that we were doing that was working, and and they really don't understand how they failed. It's a huge issue for them, trying to sort out these issues. And that was the first time I realized that how a country looks at itself and goes forward with its assimilation policies and multicultural policies is really important to the health of the nation. Because if someone had told me, or told my father when he came here, you can't, you won't have a job, you won't have access to citizenship, your daughter will not be allowed to dress the way she wants, you will not be able to worship in the way they want, then he would have been a broken man, and I would have been a broken woman, and I wouldn't be standing here before you today with the career that I have, or with the accomplishments that I have. That was something I had because of the way Canada, saw its future and saw the future of its immigrants. And when I go back to the time of my father, when he lived with Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims in peace, I mean, that was a time period when you could destroy something like that very easily by, you know, emphasizing stereotypes or emphasizing the differences of people. And we are seeing those same patterns emerge now in the United States, right? With Trump, we saw some of those same patterns emerge with Stephen Harper, where he was trying to get people to look at Muslim women, where an entire election was fought over a Muslim woman who just wanted to sing the national anthem wearing her niqab, right? Like if you think of politics, the things that we're supposed to be worried about should be jobs and the economy and making sure we have a strong country and our trade laws. But he focused the election on this one woman who was willing to take off her face veil, you know, to be identified for her citizenship. He just wanted to stand in a room and just sing a national anthem with her face covered. And he was trying to use sort of those divisive policies or that sort of fear of the other to galvanize a population and say, you know, we have to keep these immigrants out. They are changing our values. They are changing. And these are the same words and techniques that have been used by colonialist powers in the past to divide people, to look, so that we look at our neighbors and think, no, they're foreign and they're kind of weird and there's something strange or something violent and they're going to come into our country and change it. And yet, when we look at newcomers, and if they are given the chance and the support, they can actually thrive in a country and make a country stronger and more vibrant and more diverse. Because we need that diversity in order to become, you know, a stronger and more successful and more healthy society. And you can see the societies that have refused to allow immigration in, what happens to them. I mean, Japan is a clear example. If you see, you know, they want to have a very monoculture, mono-ethnic society. But every westernized, industrialized country, their population base starts to fall, and you need a large tax base to support the elderly. Like, you want your pyramid to be like this, right? And what's happening with Japan is that because it will not allow any newcomers in, they have a reverse pyramid. So the young people are the smallest group, and the elderly are the largest group, and their population is decreasing by the millions every year. And until, you know, there will be a point where the economy will collapse because there just aren't enough young people to keep that country going. Even in Canada, where we allow 250,000 immigrants a year, our population now is showing the first signs of declining, because when we become an industrialized community, there's simply no way to convince women to have those 16 babies anymore. We won't do it, right? You need 2.5 babies, 2.1? I don't know how to have 0.1 baby, but you need to at least replace yourself, right? In order for society to grow. And for whatever reason, when a society becomes industrialized, the birth rates plummet. And so we depend on bringing in newcomers to help us boost it up. But within a generation, the birth rate of newcomers also becomes the same as everybody else. So, but that's the only way, you know, countries can stay healthy and grow, is to have a stable society, is to have, you know, both groups have to be working together in partnership to help your community. And the US and Canada, know we have our issues, but by and large, compared to Europe, we're doing much better. You know, we have internalized issues like racism against First Nations, which I know a lot about because I live in Saskatchewan, and that's something that we still have to deal with as a society. It's, you know, it's considered Canada's greatest shame, and it's something that, you know, I like to talk about because I think, you know, if anyone hasn't read just the first page of the Truth and Reconciliation report, have you guys heard of the TRC report that came out? I would just encourage you just to read the first page, just to open your eyes to understand what the history of what has happened to First Nations in Canada and what we owe in terms of understanding and learning, you know, from the lessons of the past and helping another community heal and become, you know, part of our, you know, economic, you know, superiority. Like, that's really, really important. So I'm a babbler, and I was only given 45 minutes to speak, but these are the lessons that I've learned, and these are the examples that I wanted to talk about how important the work that you guys are doing here in terms of helping newcomers, you know, fit in and to assimilate and to thrive and to give them emotional and social and moral support, and how critical that is to the health of a nation, because it's a microcosm of who we are as a society, is what each one of you here today is doing for just one person, because that represents who we are as a nation and what our ethos is as human beings and what we consider, you know, are being good Canadians. So I don't want to underestimate the work that all of you are doing here at Silver Spire in terms of helping newcomers, because it is critical. Everything that you do is critical to the success of our nation and to the health of our nation. So I want to congratulate you guys for doing the right thing and to being, into being, a critical part of, civic engagement and the backbone of the support that we need for our newcomers. And I wish I had you guys when I was growing up, because it was really, really hard. Being a newcomer and learn, I mean, I did learn the language, but that was a difficult time in our country when the first waves of Pakistani immigrants came from England. Some people were very unhappy. I was talking to someone from Brampton, Ontario. I grew up in Brampton, Ontario, where I was the only brown person. The irony, right? And we would get beat up every single day, going to school every single day, coming back. My father had to put my brother and I in karate lessons so we could defend ourselves and survive the walk to school and back. And someone was just saying, I'm not sure who it was, that they have a friend whose daughter is the only white person in class. And that she gets picked on. I was thinking. Anyway, do you have questions? Because I know I can fill the time with my babbling. Do you want me to come down? I can hardly see you. Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. I'm from Alberta, so I'm your name right. But I live here. What's your next project?
My next project, that's a good question. So I wrote my memoir. Okay, so this is how I have to explain it, right? Okay, so I wrote a comedy. It's a novel. It's about a Muslim woman who accidentally joins an ISIS-like group. But I couldn't use the name ISIS, obviously, so I called them the Dominion of the Islamic Caliphate and Kingdoms, and she brings down this group, right? So it's called The Rise and Fall of Dick. I can't tell my mother. Yeah. It might be in poor taste right now. I have to wait. I think the publishers are a little leery, so we'll wait. We'll wait on that one. And then again, I'm still doing the hustle with trying to get another TV show off the ground. It's actually really challenging because it's not a lot of money. Canada feels like they gave me my shot, so I'm trying to do it in the United States, which is also another challenge. So as my mother says, ask people to pray for you. So you're all people of faith. I expect you to be on your hands and knees, or however Christians pray these days. Just pray for me that I will be able to make the first American Muslim sitcom. Yes, inshallah. Yeah.
What does your father think?
My father. I think what my father thinks now is what his biggest worry was, that women have so much potential in terms of education and jobs and are never able to fulfill that potential because their lives get subsumed with husband and children and all these other things, and that they always sacrifice themselves to take care of other people, as we all know. And he didn't want me to fall into that category where I live with regret, where I look at my life and say, I wish I could have. And I think for him, seeing that I got married and had children and yet still succeeded in the arts, which was really hard with 4 children, but I guess he never considered that men can also help women in their lives, that they can share the burden of raising children and housework. And I don't know why, right? Because he had never seen it, right? That he had never seen partnerships that were equal. He just never seen it, so he didn't think it was possible. And so that when I got married and, when I had to make Little Mosque on the Prairie, I had to it became so political because it was so successful for CBC that I would hope it would be made in Saskatchewan, where I lived and had 4 children and a husband, but they moved it to Toronto, because they figured all of us live here and she's the only one who lives there, so why are we all going there? And so they made me go back and forth. So I was traveling for 6 months, and I would only come home on weekends. And so suddenly my husband had to be the full-time caregiver and the parent. And so my mother was just like, no, you got to give it up. He'll divorce you. It'll be over, right? It's not possible for a man doing these things, a man, right? A man alone with children. Because in their eyes, they were very traditional, and they had never seen a relationship like that where the man would stay home, look after children, be the primary caregiver. So it took them a while to sort of realize that there were these other models of partnerships. And once my mother was secure that my husband wasn't going to leave me, she stopped harassing me about quitting work. And my father saw that I was really happy and I was fulfilled as an artist, fulfilling my potential. So that I think that fear in him that I would have to sacrifice that potential of who I was disappeared. And so now he's quite happy, and he realizes other career opportunities besides medicine. No, I shouldn't say that. I have a daughter who's trying to get into medicine, and he's just so supportive, right? he dotes on her because he dreams of just one day, then maybe he's given up on this generation, it's the next one he has hope for, right? Because my daughter wants to write her MCAT next year, and I'm like, oh my God. She goes, I have to go away to study because I'm too distracted at home. I go, live with him. Live with him. He will drive you back and forth to the university. And she's like, oh, that's a good idea. Live with Nanu. I go, yeah. Right? So I've now handed the torch to her. I go, try to make his dreams come true. He's still very much alive in his heart. If he was here talking to you, he would tell you to become a doctor and go to medical school. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like a different generation, right? It's hard to get rid of those belief systems. But yeah. Yep. No. I did not have an arranged marriage. My brother wanted to marry a white person, which in my mother's mind was like, oh my God, right? Nothing wrong with white people. I have nothing wrong with white people. No offense, but to my mom, it's like, oh my God, right? Like, it'll be the end of... Because you have to understand, like, my parents came from a generation and a culture where we're Punjabi, so it's like, the purity of the line. They're like Nazis, really. They're like, you have, birds of a feather have to stick together. We all have to be married with a tribal culture. Not only just Punjabis, but like from the village that they were, and I'm like, are you crazy? We live in Toronto. Where are you going to find that? But luckily for me, like when you start to get, like I was 26, and like that's like a spinster, like you're pretty much, there's no more hope for you. So my mother was like, oh God, like, there's no one's going to take her, and we're never going to find anyone for her. And so their defenses were a little bit down. And then when Muzammal said, I want to marry Suzanne, who's white, my mother invoked the ancient Punjabi code where the daughter, even if she's younger, the brothers can't get married until the daughter gets married first, because then otherwise the matchmakers in the village will say she's damaged goods, and then nobody will come for her, right? This is crazy. And my brother's like, well, we live in Toronto. There aren't any matchmakers, right? And my mom's like, no, that's the way it's going to be. Until she gets married, you can't get married. And so I was like, wait. And so suddenly my brother started phoning all his friends, right? Across the country going, someone help me because she's showing no signs of attracting anyone. And it's not my fault, right? Because you get raised by some crazy kooky father like me who's like, men are like, like kryptonite. So you don't know how to flirt or attract men. Like, I don't know how you do things like that. I've got no basis of, how to deal with the opposite gender. So of course I wasn't attracting anyone. So he sent these phone calls all across the country, and he found my husband, who was this lonely medical student up in Larange. For those of you who know, Saskatchewan is 7 hours north of Regina. So he was living in this tiny little remote community in Larange, and he gets this phone call going, would you like to get married? He's like, sure, because he wasn't meeting any Muslim women up there, right? And so I think somehow we phoned each other, and we realized people were trying to set us up. And meanwhile, like, all these men are coming every week from... I stopped giving them names. I would call them by their state, like Atlanta or Nebraska or Florida, right? So I could dehumanize them, right? And I was just like, oh my God, right? I just want to marry someone that I could relate to. And I remember the first thing he said to me on the phone when he called my husband he said, oh, I've heard a lot about you. Because I just wanted someone who knew who I was. It wasn't just coming for, to get his papers. And I thought, that's it, I'm marrying him. Like, that's it, I'm marrying him. I thought, that's it. But now the question was, how do you convince him, right? Because he doesn't know how crazy I am. And so I had to wait 10 weeks because he wasn't going to get a holiday for 10 weeks. He's like, I'll be there in 10 weeks. I'm like, wait, no, you have to come now, right? He's like, he didn't know the background of what was happening in my life. He's like, well, I can't, right? He goes, you're just going to have to wait. And it was like the horrible, like, waiting 10 weeks for him to show up and then having to sort of act like I was, interested in flirting. Like, it was so hard, right? Because I didn't know the world of men or how you do those things. And he thought I was really kooky. Like, and then later on, he realized, like, the background and the history and all that. He goes, you just married me because you were desperate. I'm like, yeah, pretty much, right? But it worked out. Like, we had similar interests, and, we saw eye to eye. And he was looking for someone who had a career, and we wanted to support her, and he was looking for somebody on equal footing, which was good, right? Because that was, I needed his support, because I didn't know my life would take this crazy turn at a certain point. But yeah, so yeah. Then my brother married Suzanne, and then they divorced, as my mother predicted 25 years later, because as white people, you can't trust them, right? So they always run. That's what my mother says. White women, they always run, right? They're not like us. We stay no matter how horrible it is. We stay, right? And so it came to, but now he's on a second white wife, so it's okay. So I have more ex-sister-in-laws than I have brothers, you guys, right? But yeah. Don't tell my parents. Thank God I didn't invite them here today. Oh. They live in Oakville. They're stalkers. Yeah. I moved to Regina because you guys probably don't know, but because when I married him, I said, there's no way I'm moving to Saskatchewan. Are you crazy, right? Because I lived in Toronto. I grew up in Toronto. Like, and you know how people from Toronto are. We're arrogant, and we think the rest of the country, like, what is the rest of the country? It's just like, we're like Americans, right? Like, we just think Toronto is the center of the universe. So when I met him, he still remembers us to this day. He's like, I said to him, so Saskatchewan, is that 1 or 2 provinces over? And he's like, oh my God, it's true what they say about you people. And I'm like, us people? Like, what's wrong with us people? And it was true. I didn't know anything about Saskatchewan. I was like, yeah, no, can't do it, not going there. And then I married him, and then 2 days later, the Ontario government passed a law. Never have been passed before or after, and I don't think if you Googled it, I don't think you could find it, because I've tried to Google it, right, when I tell people this story. And the law said that anybody who had a medical degree from outside of Ontario would not be granted a billing license for 3 years. And his degree was from Saskatchewan, right? So we moved to Ontario, and they wouldn't give him a billing number. So that means he couldn't practice for 3 years. And of course, I get pregnant instantly, right? And I was working for Peter Zosky show. I had a 1-year contract, and I could only fulfill 6 months of it because I gave birth, and then I was living with my parents because I was on unemployment. My husband was unemployed. My mother would be like, oh, finally we got her married, and now they're both unemployed living in my living room. So she kicked us out. Can you believe it? She said, that's it? No, you're not, go back. You're destroying his life. Go back to Saskatchewan. So literally it was like, which I consider the act of God, right? Because nobody else can explain it any other way. Had to go back and live in Saskatchewan because Ontario wouldn't grant him a billing license. So I'm convinced this was divine intervention because I refused to go the first time. So God had to do something to force me back. And so that literally was why I ended up moving. And it was so interesting because when I moved there, I was like, that's it. I will never have a career again. I will never work. What do people do in Saskatchewan? Because at that point in my mind, I thought I was going to be an international journalist, and I was going to be famous and do international politics, and I'm like in Saskatchewan, like they're covering farm and agricultural and skunk news. What, what am I going to do here? And that was when the idea, that was when the NFB approached me, and the whole idea of the documentary Me and the Mosque came about, and then Little Mosque in the Prairie, and then my whole life changed, right? Because of that move. And I would have never believed it in a million years. At the time, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be the end of my career. And so that's my lesson when I talk to young people, is that you don't know. Like, if you don't get into the school that you think you're supposed to get into, or you have to move somewhere where you think is remote, you don't know how that can actually change and be better for you than if you had stayed in the city or gone to the career that you thought you belonged to. So you have to have faith. It's good to talk to people of God, right? Because then you can explain these things to them, right? Sometimes God has to make you do things because you're not willing to, see things for yourself. So since then, I've been much more open to change. But I'd like to stay in one place. I think Saskatchewan is good. That's enough. And so the kids love Saskatchewan. Yep. Where do I live? Regina. So it's the capital city, which has seen a lot of changes. For those of you who don't know Saskatchewan, are you from there? Back in the day, there were no brown people, right? Other than First Nations, it was very, very homogeneous culturally. I mean, it's a farming community, right? We are the breadbasket of Canada. Am I being kicked off? Yes? Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, I'll wrap it up in 2 minutes. So what's happening in Saskatchewan is that all the white people don't consider it exciting enough, so they go to Calgary, right? So our tax base was starting to get low, and that's a dangerous thing. When your tax base starts to get low, you can't support a community anymore. So the government got desperate and said, what are we going to do? And they realized that they needed to get immigrants to come to Saskatchewan and stop moving to Toronto and Vancouver. So then they changed the laws, and they started a nominee program where they would fast-track immigration. They would give citizenship in 1 year, family reunification. So suddenly entire villages around the world just emptied out and landed in Saskatchewan. I am not kidding. If you go there today, you're just like, what is happening? You go to the DMV and there'll be Africans with the whole headgear, and you're like, and I'd be like, who let you in, right? So I'm like, and I'm a daughter of immigrants, so it just overnight the entire place has changed. We grew from 100,000 to 130,000 within 5 years. Because we needed people, we needed human beings, and the government, had the foresight to realize we needed people, and they keep going to, and the immigrant communities won't establish themselves in places where there's too few people. They want a larger support network, but now we have those support networks starting in Saskatchewan, and we have a lot of learning to do because we haven't had that in our history before. But it's fascinating to see. Saskatchewan today reminds me of what Toronto was like in the 70s. in terms of that really rapid change that's happened. But it's come to us even. Sorry, I need to stop talking, right?
I hate to do that. Am I on there? Okay. Well, this white woman.
And you stayed married. You didn't run from Jim. No. So you guys can do it too, right?
That's right. I'm going to speak on behalf of all the colors here and all of us, because I know we'd all like to say thank you to you. Thank you for coming to be with us. This venture today has been enriched by your experiences for sure. Stories of newcomers are all different, and yours is unique. And I'm sure everyone who has worked with the newcomers and all the newcomers here have their unique stories too. I have a sense that every one of them could teach us something. But you've taught us a lot this afternoon. Thank you for inviting us on your journey, for sharing your insights that you can't, well, I was going to say you can't get from a book, but you can. You can get it from a wonderful book called Laughing All the Way to the Mosque, and it is a wonderful read. We have enjoyed it. Our book group read it, and then we had one evening when we all picked out our favorite chapter, and we howled and we laughed and we learned, and gave us such insights into your life and the lives of other Muslims. So we appreciate it very much, and I know we all appreciated having you here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Oh, thank you, guys. Thank you.
So I would just invite you all to sit down for one more minute. And to answer your question, yes, we are kicking you off because we know that you've got to be at the library at 7.
What time is it?
It's 4:15.
Okay.
And you need to eat.
Okay.
You might not realize that right now, but you need to eat and sustain yourself. And so we are kicking you off the stage.
I think I'm going
with
back
regret.
there. I'm going back there.
You are going back there. You're going back there because your book's going to be sold back there,
Right.
and you're just going to hang out there.
Okay.
I just want. Hello. Is it? Okay. All right. So I just want to take this opportunity. I mean, the organizers have been thanked, the presenters have been thanked, now Zarqa has been thanked, but now it's time to thank all of you. It's time to thank all of you. For those of you who stayed the entire day, it has been a very full day. It's been a very full day, but I think a very worthwhile, informative, and because we're in this space, a very blessed day. And so I think that the participation of everybody in the sanctuary has truly blessed the experience. And so I want to thank all of those who have spoken, all of those who have listened. I hope that this conversation continues well beyond today. And I can tell you that, that within the Silver Spire community, it is a conversation that continues and will continue. I will remind you that at the end of November, so November 30th till December 3rd, the Canadian Council for Refugees is holding a consultation in Niagara Falls. There was information upstairs. If you want more information, you can call the Fort Erie Multicultural Center, or you can call here because we do have some information, and you probably want to talk to me. But you are now released. You can go off and live your lives. But I want to encourage you that as you are getting ready to go, buy a book. And if you have the opportunity, I think that there might be a few tickets left for, Zarqa is doing a reading tonight at the public library, the downtown public library. And so if you would like to hear a little bit more, then I would encourage you to leave, stop, buy a book, go down the street, around the corner, go to the library, and see if they have a ticket for you, and then go get something to eat. But, good night.